Johnny CIA did every U.S. led coup mapped, which I don't know if he's going to do an anti-CIA video here or a pro one.
There's a weapon. Okay, so here's how I'm defining the US-led coups that I'm going to put on our list here. Number one, they were successful. There's a lot of failed coup attempts. We're leaving those out. Number two, there must be at least one US government official involved in the coup. And number three, we need concrete evidence that the US was actually involved, not just speculation. While the US has been involved in tons of regime change efforts around the world, we landed on a much shorter list.
No way. Oh no. Wait, is he saying that like the list is actually much shorter than the real list? What are the he omitted the failed coups? Okay. Wait, maybe this is not that bad. This is not that bad. No. This could be not that bad. A failed coup is still a coup d'etat. I don't think he's saying that those aren't like actual coups. Wait, he's only counted the ones that have evidence, it seems? No, that doesn't mean that these are the ones that have evidence. He's only counted the ones that the CIA has declassified is what that means. Because all of those other coup attempts and failed coups and everything else has plenty of evidence. It's just like acknowledgement is what is lacking. Some of them do have tacit endorsements or acknowledgements, especially in the case of like Venezuela, for example. Like a big marker for an American coup is when the Chamber of Commerce's leader is appointed to the presidency of Venezuela immediately after a coup happens. And then the American government takes 25 minutes to recognize the Chamber of Commerce president as the new president of fucking Venezuela. That's a coup d'etat. It might not directly say that that's a coup d'etat, but that's a fucking coup d'etat. It's a failed one, because the people immediately took to the fucking streets. But that's enough evidence in that regard. Like, holy shit, what more evidence do you need?
We're going to move on to the next coup, but I need to thank today's sponsor who makes these videos possible.
The CIA.
Spain's glory days have come and gone. They are a declining empire, and there is major resistance in their colonies, especially in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Meanwhile, the US is a rising empire. They don't love the idea of true independence for places like Cuba or Puerto Rico. And, like Hawaii, American companies have money invested, particularly in Cuba. Independence might mean them getting kicked out. So the US sends in troops to liberate the rebels fighting against their Spanish colonizers, promising them independence. Not only in Cuba and Puerto Rico, but later over here in the Philippines and Guam. These local uprisings eventually drive out the Spanish. And in all of these cases, the US reneges on their promise to give independence to these locals.
Yeah, no, liberated, but like not really at all, actually. Not even remotely close. Liberated is a really funny way to describe the situation unfold when you're talking about like almost identical styles of governance and continued enslavement and colonial extraction of resources. I guess he said it sarcastically, right? He's saying like liberated, and you can hear it saying like in air quotes.
Okay, so we're over here in Nicaragua. It's 1909. There's a bunch of powerful American companies here, but a new president comes to power vowing to regulate them. The US is not going to let this happen. So the Secretary of State starts spreading rumors to smear this guy, this president, saying that he's building a canal that would compete with the Panama Canal. But really, they're just upset because Nicaragua is taking loans from Europe. The US keeps painting this guy as a war criminal and someone worthy of being thrown out.
Bro, that's so crazy. I mean, good thing we don't ever do that now. And like, they don't even need to be good guys overall. Not many state leaders are. But like, good thing we never do that now when we're like trying to implement regime change. You know what I mean? Like, we would never do that now. Guys, stop. Stop saying Pepela. We never do that now. We are so different. No, you don't understand. Every single country that we happen to, be enemies with, all are run by corrupt dictators, okay? And a very different style of governance than our government, which is like certainly not corrupt nor dictatorial. It just happens to be that way. It's just a coincidence that like all of the countries that we are actively trying to do regime change in, they're all the bad guys against us, the good guys. The rules based on international order make more sense when you realize U.S. interests are exempt when wanted. No, the rules-based international order is created so that it can be utilized against the United States enemies. It's not that the U.S. is exempt. It's that they were written specifically so that they could be weaponized. But yeah, I want to be nice to Johnny, who makes like very piffy videos, very clever editing. They're catchy, they're entertaining, and all that. But like, this is more insidious propaganda because it like on its face makes it seem like it's leftist critique against the CIA. when in fact it's just literally like only talking about shit that the CIA recognizes and spinning it in a way that like the CIA also talks about. For example, us giving Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen at the time was very openly done, right? But it was not considered to be like, we gave weapons. We funneled weapons into Afghanistan, and we celebrated that concept because they were anti-Soviet rebels, right? They were anti-Soviet rebels who just wanted to like free their country, as Ronald Reagan said, like the founding fathers, right? But of course, when they became like, when some of those Mujahideens then turned into, the Taliban and numerous other groups, like all of a sudden it was like, oh, well, we did give them weapons, but like we had to. You know what I mean? Like there is always this whitewashing, this acknowledgement of the things that have been declassified or even celebrated, like the Mujahideen were at the time. This video is cut like it's anti-regime change, but it's done in a way where it basically kind of legitimizes the regime changes that happen. Do you see what I'm saying?
A few years later, the US is back in the region for another coup in next-door Honduras. This one was plotted by a band of private American citizens, and it follows a similar pattern. A new president comes to town, in this case directly inspired by Nicaragua's president, and he wants to take back control of the country from American businesses. In this case, we're talking about bananas. The banana companies were not going to let this happen. And it was mostly this guy, a banana businessman named Sam the Banana Man. He's not going to let this pesky president run his country. No. So he assembles his own militia. He literally buys a surplus Navy ship, loads it up with weapons, and starts his campaign to get this president out.
You could just like self-fund coup d'etats. Now the CIA is even incapable of like outsourcing it adequately in Venezuela, like what happened.
Sails from New Orleans to the coast of Honduras, and he literally invades the country with like a private army. Wait, where's the US government in all this? They also didn't like the political direction of Honduras either, so they just sort of stood back. Let this private invasion happen, and then at the critical moment, the US steps in to order a ceasefire, basically bullying the president to step down. He had no way forward, no defense, so he resigns.
Yeah, they just stayed out of the way. Huh. How did they get trained infantrymen like that, I wonder? I mean, you can just always find them around, weapons and also, Navy ships. It's certainly, like, it's just, what were the casualty numbers looking like, too? Wait, where's the mention of the 1,000 people slaughtered? I mean, dude. Places to stage and train just lying around, surplus Navy equipment lying around, weapons lying around. Dude, the U.S. government certainly was not involved in this until the last second when they just like kind of bullied. They kind of bullied the government.
Okay, so let's move forward to the 50s, where the coup
I love you, but you're being so incredibly uncharitable. This is a live video, but for normie, this video
becomes a more
American
useful
actions.
tool in the American toolkit.
What he just said is directly a coup d'etat that is admitted to, that he says the American government had like very little involvement in until like forcing a ceasefire. That's fucking bullshit.
There's this new US agency dedicated to collecting and analyzing information from all over the world, meaning for spying. They call it the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and it completely revolutionizes the art of the coup. Oh, and at this point, the US is now a full-blown global superpower, no longer just looking in their own neighborhood, but rather at the whole world map, investing huge resources into fighting their global rival and its communist ideology.
Simultaneously greatly exaggerating the influence, scope, activities, and involvements of the USSR in an effort to boost their need, Because, like, if there's no demand for it, you just got to make it up. You got to be like, dude, it's going crazy out there. They're doing mind control. They're spying on everybody. While simultaneously constantly talking about how starved the population is, and also actively recognizing that they were not starved at all and actually had, like, a higher calorie diet than the American citizen at the time. But it's like literally everything and anything you've heard about the USSR has been filtered through CIA propaganda and Red Scare propaganda.
This gets us to Iran, 1953, where Iran had just elected a new star politician, Mohammad Mossadegh. He rises to power believing that Iran must take back control of its most valuable natural resource, oil, which at the time was completely controlled by a British company called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. We know it today as BP. Mossadegh is done with this. Let's kick the British out and take back our oil. But like the US, Britain is not happy with Iranians trying to take back their resources. So they warn that if they do this, there will be consequences.
Okay, it's facts.
So the British catch a quick meeting with the CIA's Middle East guy who was passing through London, and they pitch him on this idea: let's throw out Mossadegh. The CIA's like, okay, and they kind of sniff communist vibes on Mossadegh with this big desire to nationalize Iran's oil, or at least they tell themselves they do.
By the way, Mohammed Mossadegh is like a communist only because he wanted to nationalize the oil industry. But of course, you can't do that but then you're hurting British petroleum profit margins. Like, those are British petroleum refineries that you're using. We built those because we thought that we could just like keep stealing your oil and not giving you anything in return. It's not like, I wouldn't say he's like communist in any meaningful capacity.
Roosevelt sneaks into Iran and is given $1 million taxpayer dollars to use, quote, in any way that would bring about the fall of Mossadegh. And it's a rocky start at first with a bunch of failures. But they start using their money to get traction, bribing politicians, religious clerics, and other leaders to say divisive and controversial things about Mossadegh. They hire locals to stage attacks against religious leaders, making it look like they had been ordered to do so by Mossadegh. And with enough time and money, they create an atmosphere of chaos and hostility and distrust among the public. Oh, and there's weapons. The CIA stashes enough weapons and explosives to support a, quote, 10,000-man guerrilla organization for 6 months. Like, just in case they need to, like, start a full...
Yeah, bro, that kind of stuff certainly doesn't happen anymore. Like, no color revolutions or anything like that. I'll just say it like this. Well, there's a reason why I famously always say, like, if you have anti-American sentiment when talking about like 98% of history and also whatever is going on in the world, you're gonna be right 98% of the time. But the 2% of time, you're not accounting like genuine animosity on the ground. But like, you're gonna be right 98% of the time. Now, of course, those 2%, they'll never let you live it down. They will never let you fucking shut the fuck up about that. They will never let you go, oh yeah, my bad, I was wrong about that. But it makes total sense because they used to do this shit and they still do this shit, for the record. While this is happening, the United States is doing this everywhere around the world, some unsuccessfully and some successfully, most of which is not being mentioned in this video. So if you're asking me, like, where is it happening right now? Like, can you give me an example? Literally everywhere. That does not change the reality that there might be on the ground legitimate resentment. That does not change the reality that some of the people might foolishly believe that like America has their best interests in heart. Kurdish people being one of the primary examples of this, even though Kurdish people at this stage perfectly recognize that they are just being utilized as a militia force and they are more valuable to U.S. State Department interests as like a roving a band of different militias that fight America's battles in the Middle East. Like everywhere where there is any kind of political movement, whether it be African nations, whether it be in Asia, whether it be in the Middle East, America has at least some of its tentacles involved. Like that's why, for example, Juan Guaido, you might not like Maduro. Okay, Maduro, you might not like him. You might not consider him to be a good leader. But Juan Guaido, the first thing he tried to do to utilize way above the rights and responsibility that the fucking Constitution had afforded him as like a potential interim period of presidency, immediately talked about privatizing oil refineries. Why? Like, is that the most pressing matter? Is that what the Venezuelan people are yearning for? They're yearning for freedom by privatizing their oil refineries. That's what it was? No, it's the same shit. They do it all the time. They do it nonstop.
Under the Shah, Iran becomes a brutal police state. He executed military officers, student leaders, anyone associated with Mossadegh. He set up a secret police force, and life was brutal. So brutal that in 1979, the frustration of Iranians burst forth in mass protests that ran the Shah out of office and replaced him with an inspiring new leader who would turn Iran into an Islamic republic, built in part off a foundation of resentment for the US having meddled in their country.
I mean, this is 100%. This is what I talk about. I mean, it's like reductive, but this is what I mean. When I talk about like all of these Middle Eastern countries that you look at and you're like, what the fuck? They're living in a different time period. It's like, that wasn't the case for literally all of these countries, okay? The only reason why Turkey, I guess Turkey now is a little bit different, but the only reason why Turkey did not get impacted in a similar way was because it was a part of NATO and allowed the United States to put fucking missile bases directed at the USSR. And even internally in Turkey, we had a fucking Cold War of our own. That happened. That happened internally in Turkey too. Why the fuck were the Turkish communists and the Turkish ultranationalists fighting against one another? Do you understand which side the Turkish ultranationalists who was being armed in that fight, or who inevitably won, I guess. The United States of America, of course, was funding, arming, training, and allowing the ultranationalist Grey Wolves to operate. They did this in the entirety of Europe too. One of the most famous instances being Gladio. They did it through NATO. For our allies, we did it through NATO. For our enemies, we did it in ways like this.
The Islamic Republic has held power ever since, and has morphed into the oppressive theocracy we know today.
Like, why was there no network internally? Do you think the Iranian population had no communists, had no revolutionary forces within it? Or were they eradicated successfully? Because time and time again, America always considered fascist reactionaries to be valuable allies, especially in the fight against communist revolutionaries, which they saw to be the real threat. Because communist revolutionaries, whenever they took power, would do shit like nationalize the oil industry, would do things that would undermine the authority that the IMF and the World Bank was trying to create on the third world. The USSR was a flawed, imperfect nation, but imagine how more unsafe the third world would have been in the second half of the 20th had the USSR not existed to be a counterbalance, a force to put America in its place whenever America wanted to swing its big dick across the third world domestic politics. Yeah, I mean, literally. A lot of Americans look to the Cold War era and think like a multipolar world was devastating and terrifying. Yeah, it was. Yeah, the world was terrifying and incredibly violent when these two warring nations were constantly dick swinging, but only made more terrifying because America kept arming fucking fascists who would do gruesome atrocities in the name of anti-communist action. You know, not dissimilar to Nazi Germany, if you want to think about it like domestically, you know? Capital owners sided with fascists in the lead up to World War II because they saw fascism as an adequate mechanism of control. They saw fascism. They saw, on the one hand, revolutionary action growing through trade unionists, communists alike, socialists, and they saw fascists that promised control over that through violent means, and they chose their guy. America literally took that and basically made it global. They were like, that's fire. We're going to keep doing that. That's the best. That's why I always say we are the villains of the world.
Before we go on, a quick reminder that all of these coups, these plans to overthrow leaders in other countries, did not require American votes or consensus or approval of Congress. It was usually just a few key men in government buildings in Washington, D.C. making this happen. These people would go on to define the Cold War and shape so many...
No, I don't agree with that either. No, it's not like a couple people, dude. What the fuck? This is a collection of interests that they are managing and defending. And I would go so far as to say that the reason why they're in that position is because they're defending those interests. It's the same as like in manufacturing consent. Who rises to the top in the media? It's a self-selecting pool of individuals that inevitably cuts those who are going against the grain, who will then speak out against the unjustifiable constructs. Like, that's how it always works. It's not just like a couple guys acting out on their own desires. It's usually people that were elevated to that position because they are at the time, the best person to advocate for the desires of the bourgeois capital-owning class.
The next year in Guatemala, the CIA tried to pull the same playbook that they used in Iran, once again targeting a leader that the people had elected, but who wanted to take back the country's resources for the people, to break up these American monopolies that controlled the country's electricity and railroad. The president even starts to seize land from one massive banana company. It was often unused land that he wanted to redistribute to the locals who could farm it and feed their families.
How dare, dude, fuck this guy. I mean, I don't like that.
But the fact is that the US decided that they had to defend the banana companies, or else more communist reforms would spread. So the US President and Secretary of State ordered an overthrow, and the CIA got right to work.
I'll say this much. Remember what I used to always say? It's literally basic social democratic moves that a lot of these nations are making, and it's the way to look at it is like that Family Guy color blotter. You know what I mean? It's like, it's social democracy and it's fine if it's a white European nation, It's completely a no-no if it's a brown Latin American, South American, Central American, or African or Middle Eastern nation. Then it's like, it's communism. It can't be happening. We need to stop it. Literally, these were nations that were prevented from emancipation, prevented from utilizing their own natural resources every single time.
They set up a secret operation base on the outskirts of Miami. They start delivering weapons to the Panama Canal. But like the other coups, it can't just all be about weapons. They gotta own the information space. So they create a radio station that sounds like it's a local Guatemalan radio station, but really it's being operated out of a small town in Florida. And they start publishing fake news about an uprising, unrest, a rebellion. And then, at the same time, the fighters that the CIA had trained and armed invades Guatemala. Pilots start dropping bombs on fuel tanks and military posts and airports.
I also want to mention one other thing. For everybody who is like looking at this and seeing that like the tactics have never changed and it's almost identical, this is literally the reason why a lot of countries that are not inside of the Western hegemonic power structure as like aligned nations have such rigorous information control. They saw this happen over and over again. They still try to implement this in Cuba regularly, but that is also part of the reason why a lot of these countries, including Cuba, including China, do such rigorous information control and do not allow dissemination of information in their countries that is not completely fucking, checked by the government. This is happening everywhere. Obviously, when our allies, when our aligned nations are doing it, they're doing it at their own behest because they're capitalists, they're allies. But that is precisely the reason why information control happens in these countries. I don't like it. I live in America. I like the freedom of information here. I like the supposed freedoms for the most part. But like I like the liberty that I have, right? But I certainly understand why other countries are more authoritarian when they are not completely inside of the bosom of America, okay? When they're outside of it, they have to engage in this because they don't want to fucking have coup d'etats. But the irony, of course, is that America will then look at that, point to it, and go, look at how authoritarian these countries are. And they are authoritarian. Dude, literally can't say a good thing about America without a backhand dig law. I mean, dude, whose channel are you on, brother? When America was at war, we implemented the Espionage Act. We were fucking ruthless. We literally built concentration camps for Japanese people that were living here. Do you understand? Don't talk to me about fucking Cuba or China or any of these other fucking places, and how authoritarian they are, because they're constantly fucking, under threat, under legitimate threat. Maybe not China as much, especially because like the economic power that they have is massive. But as far as like authoritarian means of controlling information, yeah, that's going to happen.
And just like that, one president is out and the hand-picked CIA option is in. This new regime is brutal and goes on to do horrible things, detaining people they thought were communists, killing prisoners.
They did all this shit while also the environmental degradation they caused was also vast too. Remember that. It was insane. They were just like fucking, they were just like ripping forests apart. Currently, we talk about fucking what Bolsonaro did in the rainforest in Brazil, and we're like, oh, that's a big no-no. What are you doing? Meanwhile, we did that everywhere. Yeah, also, Johnny is like definitely, laying this on super gently when he says detaining people that they thought were communists. It's like, you're just like fucking murdering farmers, dude. That's what you were doing. By the way, Arbenz was never like officially aligned with communist thought or was a communist in any capacity. He was a social democrat. And for those of you who are wondering, like, when we do stuff like this, the impact that we leave behind is what leads to massive amounts of immigrants because of the economic turmoil. Like, whenever people talk about immigration being like a huge issue or whatever in America, people refuse to recognize America's impact. I'll tell it to you like this. Chatters, you grew up in your hometown. Your friends and your family live there. Why the fuck would you ever like leave your hometown if you didn't have to? I mean, some people have like big dreams. They want to go to the city, yada, yada. That's not what I'm talking about. You never want to like leave your friends and family and your culture behind to go somewhere else that doesn't even understand your language, that is going to treat you like a fucking outsider, that you can't even like legally enter half the fucking time. You do that because you're literally forced to. Why are you forced? Because the economic devastation that we brought about is the leading cause for the instability in these countries and the lack of opportunities in those countries. We go there, we build a couple railroads so we can like more efficiently fucking process their natural resources. We give none of them the fucking profits. We rob them fucking blind. That's why people always say Africa as a continent is not a poor continent. As a matter of fact, Africa's biggest fault was it's a very rich continent, okay, with vast riches. The problem is those vast riches were robbed. We pillaged them. A lot of the leaders in America cooed were social democrats for sure, but why did America allow for social democracies to thrive in Europe but not anywhere in the world? Because they already had a stranglehold through the Marshall Plan and post-World War II development through NATO. They already have full control. They were white. They had full control over these countries. You know, that was fine. They were allowed. They did, by the way, they also did that in Europe too. They did not allow social democracies to thrive in Europe. They literally killed trade unionists in Europe too. They killed social democrats or stopped social democrats in European nations as well. And then once neoliberals were in power or like right-wing institutions were in power, they were like, all right, we're good now. Yeah, Swedish prime minister is a good example of this. Italy is a great example of this. Greece is another example of this. So the idea that like America didn't do this exact same shit, maybe they didn't do it in the same like overt and like glaringly obvious and very violent ways, even though there was a lot of terrorism, but they very effectively dismantled socialist movements in Western Europe as well. Some by way of economic development, aiding the restoration of Western Europe, and some by way of, you know, straight up fucking murdering all of the anti-fascists. I think another reason was proximity, other than like them being white nations overall, their proximity to the USSR played a key role here. I think that America wasn't as like aggressive in the immediate aftermath of World War II with respect to like implementing coups in the same way that they're doing this. And the USSR being the big bad scary guy wasn't actually a big bad scary guy because of its like weapons. It was a big bad scary guy because there were plenty of fucking communists that were still in these countries. And if America started openly fucking doing the same shit that they were doing in like all these other nations, they were worried that people would look to and could very quickly get help from the USSR. These trade unionists and communists and socialists alike. I think that was part of the reason why they were allowed basically to have more social democratic liberties. And some of them were long-standing too, you know what I mean? Like welfare systems that were that were experimented on even before World War II, you know what I mean? Like they were just expanding on pre-existing structures.
All right, let's go to Africa. So it's 1960 here in the center of Africa, a country called Congo. They just gained independence from Belgium, and they have an election. And this guy, Patrice Lumumba, wins, becomes the prime minister. But immediately, over in Washington, the communist alarm bells instantly start sounding off. Because we're in the middle of the Cold War, and Congo is a place full of tons of natural resources, including loads of uranium, the main ingredient for nuclear bombs. This is at a time when Americans are keeping gas masks next to their bed and have hordes of canned goods in their basements.
A lot of this was also, again, like what he just explained as far as like the fear of all out like nuclear warfare, nuclear holocaust, that kind of thing. It was also agitated propaganda. It was basically not agitated propaganda, but it was just propaganda that like, you know, the USSR had a lot of weapons. There's a missile gap. They have too much. They can fucking destroy us on a moment's notice. Like, things that you are seeing even now with like slowly but surely subtly describing how much of a, you know, looming threat China is with its balloon gap, or, you know, the increasing like agitation between the United States and China. All of that is super, super old school Cold War propaganda against the USSR. America rarely ever updates its model. They just kind of do the exact same thing over and over again because it's like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Well, it doesn't really work that well lately, but...
They start allying with Lumumba's political enemies and Congo's former colonizer Belgium. They bribe politicians, they fund protests and labor movements, and they circulate propaganda, similar ingredients to the previous coups. And when the moment is right, all these bribed politicians do what the CIA asked them to. They remove Lumumba from power. this political solution was actually not the first try. The CIA had tried to assassinate Lumumba in the past, but all of those attempts failed, which is why they turned to hijacking and manipulating Congolese politics, a brand new democracy, supporting the people who would eventually go on to put Lumumba in front of a Congolese and Belgian firing squad, making this effectively a political assassination, supported from an ocean away. And yet there's so much gray area in these coups. In this case, it's really tough to prove that the CIA's support was the key factor in Lumumba's assassination. It's debated to this day.
I don't understand. If you recognize it, then why do you... Dude, this is the second time he's done this. Why is this debatable? You facilitate the removal you facilitate the ousting, and then the execution comes along with that. What do you mean? What the fuck is that?
There's a brutal dictator here in the Dominican Republic. I mean, this guy's really bad. He's rumored to feed his opponents to sharks. But anyway, what the US cares about is that there's fear that a communist revolution could happen at any moment. So the CIA sends weapons to a group of hitmen who go assassinate this guy. And eventually the US sends in forces to occupy the DR to make sure that a leftist candidate doesn't come to power.
It's like the meme where it's oh, socialism never works, which is why socialism never works, when we involve ourselves with it. I always say the same thing. It's like, if socialism doesn't work, if it's like a fucking absolute failure, if it's a genuine failure, why don't you just allow it to fail? Why do you always have to do everything in your fucking power to physically rip people for not even doing socialism, by the way, but just socialization, literacy programs, nationalization of certain key sectors, liberties allowed, liberties that were given to Western European nations.
Vietnam was divided in two, between communist and pro-Western governments. The US needs the South to stay on their side, but Washington starts to lose confidence in this guy, the South's leader. He's losing a grip on the country, and the US fears that communism will take over the whole country of Vietnam. So the CIA rolls up its sleeves. It's time for another coup.
It's odd that he's not talking about this as an extension of colonialism. He really skimmed over the Belgian involvement in the Congo and didn't even mention the French in Vietnam. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I was gonna mention that with France. He said South Vietnam is backed by Americans and North Vietnam is USSR. And it's what happened before that is, kind of important, I think. This is a nation that was fighting against colonial superpowers. One thing I mentioned, sometimes people get mad, but Ho Chi Minh was fond of the founding fathers, Uncle Ho. He saw his battle of emancipation not dissimilar to the founding fathers against England. In a different world, I mean, obviously it would not have happened, but different world, who knows? Who knows what could have happened?
This time they focus on a South Vietnamese general who also doesn't love the president, and he agrees to do the CIA's bidding. And when given the signal, the general directs his military to seize the airport and radio stations, and they block off highways. They march to the presidential palace, a bloody shootout goes down, and this President Diem, escapes. He happens to be with his brother, but it's not going well for them, so he realizes that he needs to set up a meeting to surrender. They're going to meet at a Catholic church. This was probably going to be a peaceful meeting, but when the generals arrive, they just kill him on the spot.
It's crazy.
And one national security journalist argues that Diem's assassination actually had a greater impact on American history than the murder of JFK, because it locked the US into a decade of conflict in Vietnam, which ballooned into a long war.
Locked the US into a decade of conflict in Vietnam? We were forced... Our hand was forced into going into Vietnam. Republicans don't say this in 2023. No, I'm taking it one step further. Almost objectively, everyone says, okay, we fucking should not have done that. We should not have gotten involved. Republicans don't think that. That's crazy. Yeah, we were so locked that we just kept sending, official American trainers into the field of battle who just got shot, and then we had no other option, you know what I mean? Or our ships that kept getting shot at off the coastal line. It's just who knows how it happened, That's a wild way to explain this.
Which ballooned into a long war, ending in an embarrassing defeat and a political crisis at home.
Yeah, that was the most embarrassing part of our experiences in Vietnam. Not the fact that we deployed in a ton of munitions, napalm, and numerous other horrifying things that we did. Not even in like North Vietnam, but in South Vietnam, where like the majority of the bombings took place. He's not even, I assume he's not even going to talk about Cambodia. He's just like skipping over an atrocity that was so devastating that it still has a permanent impact with a bunch of Vietnamese babies that are still being born with like birth defects. South Korea was also involved in Vietnam. And I think the first ever payment for South Korean war crimes, like a court case, there was a decision for the first time on a South Korean military member engaging in war crimes against the civilian population. And what I found to be particularly strange about this, hold on, I'm going to give you guys the details here. In a first ever, South Korea was ordered to compensate Vietnam War victim, right? This just happened. As a part of the ruling, Judge Park Jin-soo of the Seoul Central District Court ordered the government to pay Win $23,900 in compensation, saying what members of the 2nd Marine Brigade of South Korea did to her family clearly amounted to an illegal act. Now, what they did was, just wanton violence and murder. Win T-Tan, 62, sued the South Korean government in 2020, saying that she lost 5 relatives and she and her brother were gravely wounded when South Korean Marines swept through Pong Ni and Pong Nut villages in central Vietnam on February 12, 1968, killing more than 70 villagers. Do you know what is interesting about that date? So this is a very interesting date. I want you to pay attention to it. February 12th, 1968, where the South Korean government acknowledged its atrocities against villagers, is only 1 month removed from one of the most notorious massacres that the United States military engaged in, the My Lai massacre. On March 16th in 1968, a platoon of American soldiers killed as many as 500 unarmed citizens in My Lai, one of a cluster of small villages located near the northern coast of South Vietnam. The crime was kept a secret nearly 2 years, and it later became known as the My Lai massacre. So just remember that. And by the way, the thing about My Lai is that it is not unique. This was super, super commonplace. The notion that like Vietnam was really long and complicated and we were forced into doing this thing. And, it was just really bad because it had like a lot of political ramifications in the United States of America is insane to me. Like no matter what happens, to glance over this history is insane. Like just to brush past it.
In 1973, there's a coup in Chile that is a very complicated story with conflicting accounts, and we went down a super deep rabbit hole, and we've decided that because the evidence is not rock solid, we're going to cut it for time.
No. Bro, what? There's no way. By his own metrics of like what constitutes a coup d'etat, the fact that he just avoided talking about Chile is insane to me because there are other involvements that he mentioned that have the exact, maybe not even as much evidence as U.S. involvement in Chile. He talked about Honduras and Guatemala. I would say Chile constitutes the exact, if we use the exact same fucking metrics of what is declared a coup d'etat, Chile absolutely is a U.S. CIA-backed coup d'etat. There is extensive documentation on it. I mean, there's also this. The CIA acknowledged for the first time its extent of its deep involvement in Chile, where it dealt with coup plotters, false propagandists, and assassins. The agency planned to post a declassified report required by Congress on its website today that admits the CIA support for the 1970s kidnapping of Chile's top general for refusing to use the army to prevent the country's Congress from confirming the election of socialist Salvador Allende as president. The kidnapping failed, but General Rene Schneider was shot and died 2 days later, the day Allende's election was confirmed. CIA admits prior knowledge of the plot that overthrew Allende 3 years later, but denies direct involvement. The report says that the agency had no idea that Allende would refuse safe passage with his palace under bombardment and apparently kill himself. He was found dead of gunshot wounds. Would you rather he didn't make a video highlighting U.S. foreign meddling on a video briefly mentioning the scale of it? Personally, I think that highlighting it in general is a good thing. More people will read about it, etc. I mean, I think that covering it by at least saying, briefly, just saying like, we did horrific things there would be nice. But also on top of that, this part is like completely unacceptable in my opinion.
Okay, we're back in Africa, and it's the 80s, and over here in Libya, the dictator Muammar Gaddafi was making lots of trouble in the region, funding terrorist groups and working to expand his influence all over the region.
For the record, some of these leaders, like, Allende, even though he had some I guess by 2023 liberal standards, problematic takes about certain things. One thing I have to mention to you is that none of these leaders are perfect. No one is. It's virtually impossible to be perfect, especially if you're fighting against like a brutal dictator when you're trying to, gain independence, fight a revolutionary war, whatever. As far as like Gaddafi, yeah, he's a fucking freak. Okay. He did some crazy shit. But ultimately, where I would place him is just like a nation that was definitely better off with Gaddafi than without him.
Okay, so now it's the end of the 1980s, and the Soviets are invading Afghanistan and are meeting resistance from a bunch of fighters from all over the world who have come to Afghanistan to fight back against the Soviet occupation, many of them with fundamentalist religious motivations. But the US doesn't care about their motivation. They just care that they're willing to fight against the Soviets and the Soviets' puppet, the Afghan president.
This part is not even true. Okay, out of all of the fucking people that they're talking about, the one instance where they like actually point to a person who like would at the very least like consider them to be consider themselves to be communists, despite the fact that the USSR also thought that he was not the greatest, is this fucking guy. Secondly, the arming and funding of Mujahideen rebels predates Reagan. Operation Cyclone is just like the official recognized version, but it goes beyond that. The arming, radicalizing, and funding of rebels goes back to Carter. It predates the USSR invasion of Afghanistan. The real problem for Mohammed Najibullah was that they were ruthless towards anyone and everyone that was practicing Islam. They were the original, let's say, Reddit atheists of their time. Not great for sure. So once again, as is the case with every single fucking U.S. operation, every single overthrowing of prior administrations, there's usually at least like some groups that have legitimate and some groups that have illegitimate animosity towards the whatever formation, whatever like form of governance they have. If it's not the fucking extremely wealthy, if it's not like a Chamber of Commerce backed coup, it's usually more reactionary factions that they beef up, give arms to, and also weaponize against the government. But yes, Mohammed Najibullah, or the Afghan young communists that got into leadership, were seen as aggressive by the USSR as well. Their involvement in Afghanistan was fraught. They were not like excited to extract minerals or whatever the fuck some people say. I mean, that came along with it for sure, but there were certainly a lot of reservations before going into Afghanistan. Yes, this is something that I mention regularly. U.S. President Carter's National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski and his flex mode on a French publication, openly talking about how we were going to turn Afghanistan into Vietnam for the USSR, and by God we did, which led to the evisceration of the USSR. So I would see that as an overall success. This literally, I've quoted this so many fucking times.
We're almost to the end of our list, and we're now in modern day. It's 2003, and 150,000 American troops invade Iraq. They say that they are there to find and destroy weapons of mass destruction, but their main focus is taking out this guy, Saddam Hussein. Saddam fleeing into hiding, and President Bush declaring mission accomplished, establishing an American-friendly government in Iraq, creating once again a negative byproduct by alienating huge swaths of the Iraqi people and army who form a bunch of anti-American rebel groups that go on to fight against the American occupation, some morphing into groups like ISIS who wreak all kinds of havoc on the region. And the question of how and why we did this expensive, horrific, destructive coup is still something that there aren't really good answers to.
Yeah, what? No, there is, man. What the fuck? It's not even just oil, Afghanistan, opium, and minerals, but like, no, every single thing that he's mentioning in many ways is not just about like destroying communism. It's also about a industry that was growing permanently, especially accelerated after Eisenhower, that basically became our most prominent and sole industry, the military industrial complex. That's it. We don't need to like have a good reason or natural resources that we must extract from these countries half the fucking time anymore, because like we have this machine that demands blood. First we give the weapons, then we use our new weapons against the old weapons that we gave to the fucking area.
And this gets us to the final coup on our list. It's 2011 during a wave of protests spreading throughout this region, trying to take down all these strongman dictators, one of which was this guy, Muammar Gaddafi. And there's worry that he's going to potentially massacre all of these pro-democracy protesters.
Yeah.
So the US feels like it must get involved.
Bro, come on. How can you fucking seriously say this, bro? How can you seriously do an entire video on coup d'etats that we have like facilitated? How can you look at that and then be like, the US always found a way to, drum up support inside of like reactionary forces within the country, blah, 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 always. And then when it comes to Libya, the closer you get to like modern day, the more his narrative is just like, yeah, these were pro-democracy people that like he was trying to fucking execute because they just wanted to do democracy, I think. That's why they were, that's what the fuck was happening. It's just like his hatred for democracy overtook. And America loves democracy. In my video where I talk about all of the instances where America has like overthrown democratically elected leaders.
To save all of these pro-democracy protesters. So the US feels like it must get involved to save these protesters. They rally their NATO allies.
That statement in and of itself is like gross, dude. The US felt like it needed to be involved because they wanted to save protesters. What the fuck? What's NATO doing there? Yeah, what's going on there? Guys, NATO is a defensive force. You guys surely are not going to make the argument that NATO was being weaponized as an offensive force again. NATO is simply a defensive force. That surely would never happen. Stop. Their never-ending love for democracy led them to, do a no-fly zone and send missiles.
But at some point...
Bro, that's crazy. He literally said these guys were forced, Gaddafi forced their hand into fucking, by attacking democracy protesters. And then the mission somehow switched, just like we were locked into Vietnam.
We don't know exactly how this happened.
We don't know how. That's crazy.
So anyway, the target becomes Gaddafi. And now NATO drones are firing missiles at his convoy, and he eventually gets captured and gets killed on the spot. Libya has been in chaos ever since, but it's not like it was a great place under Gaddafi. And once again,
it objectively was a better place under Gaddafi. That is an insane thing to state. You're literally comparing at least a developed nation state. What the fuck? That is an insane fucking assessment, dude. Again, Johnny, liberal, I love the CIA Harris, straight up lapping the Republican Party's assessment on the situation. He is outright winging the Republicans on this matter. Like even Republicans who are like, yeah, I don't really give a fuck, at least because of Clinton's involvement, say like, look at Libya, there's open slave markets. Johnny Harris is more to the right than like fucking neocons, dude. Holy shit.
My purpose in doing this broad back-to-back history of American-led coups
Why is he doing
was so
this?
that we can see patterns that emerge. How a rising superpower became really good at removing leaders that didn't align with their way of seeing the world. Or, in a lot of cases, who were not friendly to American business interests. But let's be clear, the U.S. didn't invent this. This is something that powerful countries and empires have always done.
We don't look at that positively, though. That's the difference, because like we understand that like imperialism was like objectively bad. Colonialism was objectively bad. I think everybody understands that. Okay.
These U.S.-led coups, especially during the Cold War, was how the overthrow of these governments often stamped out new democracies, budding democratic movements, replacing them with authoritarian leaders who would go on to oppress the people with the support and backing of the United States. And in the process, redirecting the country's history. Lately, Russia has been meddling in the election process of the United States. And I've been reflecting.
What? No! He did not! No! It's so weird that at no point did Johnny Harris say like the United States did Facebook ads in fucking Chile. It almost feels like arming and funding rebel groups, reactionary, fascist, violent, genocidal rebel groups who then execute the leader of the state that was like democratically elected versus like Facebook ads that they bought using American companies to run misinformation campaigns. Like Russia set up Radio Free Florida. Did America not do this to Russia with Gorbachev? America did this with everyone and still continues to do it. If you see a Radio Free, Voice of America, Radio Free Ukraine, Radio Free whatever the fuck, like that's literally not even secret. Like it's just like openly, it's just basically openly fucking funded CIA propaganda. That's it. That is like what Russia did. That. It's never just misinformation. Understand? It's never just like America's biggest fault and failure isn't doing, counter-revolutionary propaganda in these countries. It's the other stuff that they did after. It's like farming and funding and arming the fucking the guys that are like out of their minds. That's the way you do a coup, not by just like misinforming the public. You know what I mean?
This is giving me just a tiny taste of what it feels like to have an outside power pulling.
What? First of all, it's not even new. The USSR used to do this shit too. What the fuck? There's a reason why MLK and every other black liberation movement was not just put down because they were like fucking, black people trying to gain civil liberties, but also because they were communists, right? Like, yeah, the USSR did agitative propaganda. That is what it's called. It's called agitprop. Yeah, of course they did that. What the fuck? That's a permanent fixture of society. That's like what warring nations or what, countries do. It doesn't even have to have like some ideological underpinning. Russia now absolutely does that for both sides. Literally, like RT is a perfect example. If you look at Russia today, they'll have programming that at like 5 p.m. is like America KKK is an imperialist warring nation and we must abolish white supremacy in the United States as it is a global superpower funding white supremacy. And at 5:30 they're like, the homosexuals in America are degenerate perverts and must be eradicated at all costs. It's like they do that. They don't give a shit. They literally have no genuine ideological reason. They just want to like cause chaos. And that's nothing. America does that too with ideological reasoning, which is pro-capitalist for the most part. Here's a quick follow-up for the clip.
Interesting one.
Socialist leader of Grenada, Maurice Bishop, explains why the U.S. empire considered their revolution to be even more dangerous.
That we saw very recently in a secret report of the State Department. I want to tell you about that one. That secret report made this point, that Grenada is different to Cuba and Nicaragua. And the Grenada Revolution is in one sense even worse, I'm using their language, than the Cuban and Nicaraguan revolutions because the people of Grenada and the leadership of Grenada speaks English and therefore can communicate directly to the people of the United States.
In a similar vein, the Haitian Revolution was always considered a particularly egregious one because not through dialogue and language, but it was black people. God forbid black people in America recognize that, similar things could happen.
But I want to tell you what that same report also said, and said that also made us very dangerous. And that is that the people of Grenada and the leadership of Grenada are predominantly black.
You watch.
And if we have 95% of predominantly African origin in our country, then we can have a dangerous appeal to 30 million black people in the United States.
Yeah. It was because of the threat posed by Maurice Bishop and the socialist government in Grenada to the U.S. empire, both abroad and at home, that he was assassinated, after which the U.S. invaded the country. People always say, Hasan, you support authoritarian governments. You're a bad guy. You support, you're a tanky. Understand that the reason why I place Cuba in a completely different place, in my heart and also in general, is for this reason. All of these other countries have fallen under the might of the U.S. empire. And to be fair, it's almost an inevitability. So for the fact that Cuba to continue, despite this egregious human rights violation, this ongoing human rights violation in the form of this embargo, the fact that it still survives under, when all facts point to the exact opposite, that's a pretty impressive feat. Like, I have to recognize that. Also, the reason why Cuba was not mentioned in the Johnny Harris video is because of that reason, ironically. That was the greatest W for Cuba, is not being mentioned in the Johnny Harris video about American coup d'etats because it wasn't successful. And trust me, they fucking tried, okay? Same with Venezuela even. Sometimes you sound like CIA is bad, therefore it's okay for dictators to violate human rights, and people in their countries who protest and speak against dictators are CIA puppets. I know you know better. Once again, I listened to you talking about Turkey and Erdogan, but I think you're not making it clear enough that those violations are unacceptable. No, of course those violations are unacceptable. But if you've listened to me talk about Turkey and Erdogan, you understand that, like, every Turk in this chat would tell you that Turkey would be in a worse place overall if Fethullah Gulen was in power, if another American coup, which was a failed one, which Johnny Harris did not mention, was the one in Turkey not that long ago. That is certainly what guides my opinion.